For 45 years, it was the only nation on Earth that could stare down the United States and not blink. It matched America, bomb for bomb, tank for tank, and ambition for ambition. It planted its flag on the world stage as a superpower, a rival empire commanding half the globe. This was the Soviet Union. But that superpower is gone, and in its place stands Russia, a nation haunted by the ghost of its own former glory, fighting a war in Ukraine not for conquest, but for resurrection. This is the story of the rise and fall of Russia's superpower dream, and how the desperate attempt to relive the past has shattered its future. In the next 25 minutes, we will unravel the tragic story of a fallen empire. We will expose the fatal miscalculation that led to the Soviet Union's collapse, a mistake Vladimir Putin is now repeating. We will reveal how the West's victory in the Cold War planted the seeds for the conflict in Ukraine today, and we will show you the one critical weapon that defeated the Soviet Union, a weapon that is not a missile or a tank, but an idea. This is the story of how a superpower was born, how it died, and why its ghost refuses to rest. At the height of its power, the Soviet Union was an undeniable colossus. Following the colossal victory in World War II, it emerged not just as a victor, but as an architect of the New World Order. It controlled a vast empire stretching from the heart of Europe to the shores of the Pacific. Its ideology, communism, presented a stark, compelling alternative to Western capitalism, inspiring revolutionary movements across the globe. This was the era of the bipolar world. Two superpowers, two economic systems, two visions for humanity's future. Locked in a standoff that threatened nuclear annihilation, the Soviet war machine was immense, a land-based leviathan that could overrun Europe in weeks. Its scientific achievements were stunning. It launched the first satellite, Sputnik, and put the first man, Yuri Gagarin, into space. To the world, and to its own people, the USSR projected an image of unstoppable, permanent power. It was not just a country, it was an equal and opposite force to the United States. The dream of superpower status was not a dream, it was a reality. But behind the propaganda posters and the May Day parades, the foundation of the Soviet Empire was rotting. The fatal flaw was its economy. While the United States was building a dynamic, consumer-driven economy that fueled innovation and wealth, the Soviet Union was trapped in the rigid, suffocating grip of central planning. The state decided what to produce, how much to produce, and at what price. The result was chronic stagnation. The Soviet economy was a giant, focused almost entirely on heavy industry, and the military, while its citizens stood in endless lines for basic necessities like bread, meat, and shoes. There was no incentive for quality, no reward for innovation. While American supermarkets overflowed with choice, Soviet stores had empty shelves. This economic decay was a cancer. It meant the USSR could keep pace with the US militarily only at a catastrophic cost, diverting resources away from everything else. The superpower was a soldier in a splendid uniform, starving to death from the inside. The economic weakness was crippling, but the final blow was to the Soviet Union's spirit. That blow landed in the mountains of Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded, expecting a swift victory. Instead, they found their own Vietnam. For a decade, the Red Army was bled dry by Mujahideen fighters, many of them armed and funded by the United States. The war became a quagmire, a brutal, unwinnable conflict that demoralized the Soviet public and exposed the limits of its military might. But more importantly, it shattered the illusion of the Soviet ideology. This was not a war of liberation. It was an imperial war of occupation, no different from the actions of the old Tsarist empire the revolution had supposedly overthrown. At the same time, a new leader emerged in Moscow, Mikhail Gorbachev. He saw the decay and tried to save the system through reforms, glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring. But it was too late. Opening the system didn't fix it. It simply allowed the pent-up frustrations of decades to explode into the open. The empire had lost its faith. The end came not with a bang, but with a series of surrenders. The year 1989 was a geopolitical earthquake. One by one, the satellite states of Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia peacefully threw off Soviet control. The Iron Curtain, which had seemed so permanent, was torn down by jubilant crowds. The symbol of the entire Cold War, the Berlin Wall, was chipped away into souvenirs. Then, in 1991, the unthinkable happened. The Soviet Union itself dissolved. 15 new nations appeared on the map almost overnight. The Red Army, once the terror of Europe, retreated in disarray. The superpower had simply vanished. For the West, it was the ultimate victory. For Russia, it was the ultimate trauma. Overnight, it lost its empire, its global status, and its identity. It was no longer a superpower. It was a bankrupt, chaotic state, forced to accept humiliating handouts from its former arch-rival. The dream was dead, and the longing for its return was born. So, we have the trajectory, the rise to superpower status. the internal economic decay, the ideological collapse in Afghanistan, and the final humiliating disintegration in 1991. The Soviet Union was gone, but in its place stood a new Russia, haunted by the ghost of its former self. In Part 2, we will meet the man who promised to exorcise that ghost. We will see how Vladimir Putin dedicated his reign to reversing the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. We will expose his strategy to rebuild the empire, a strategy that led directly to the blood-soaked fields of Ukraine. And we will answer the ultimate question: is Russia's superpower dream finally, completely, and irrevocably over? The Soviet Union was gone, but its loss created a vacuum of power, of pride, and of purpose. And into that vacuum stepped a man who saw the collapse not as a liberation, but as a national humiliation that had to be avenged. His name is Vladimir Putin, and his entire 20-year reign has been a single, sustained mission: to force the world to once again fear Russia as a superpower. When Vladimir Putin took power in 1999, he inherited a broken country. The economy was in shambles, the military was a joke, and Russian influence had evaporated. He famously called the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. This was not just a soundbite, it was his governing manifesto. His mission was one of revanchism, the political policy of reclaiming lost territory or status. He saw the 1990s not as a decade of newfound freedom, but as a time of national weakness and Western exploitation. He blamed the West for expanding NATO into former Soviet territories, seeing it as a hostile installment. He watched as American power went unchecked in the Middle East, and Putin's plan was methodical. First, he used soaring oil and gas prices to rebuild the Russian economy and fill the state's coffers. Then, he began to systematically rebuild and modernize the Russian military. And finally, he began to push back. He was not trying to resurrect communism, he was trying to resurrect fear. He wanted to restore Russia's sphere of influence and force the world to treat it as the great power it once was. Putin didn't start with Ukraine. He first tested the limits of Western resolve in a series of smaller, calculated conflicts. The Second Chechen War was his first demonstration of ruthless, uncompromising force, re-establishing Moscow's iron grip over its restive regions. Then, in 2008, he invaded Georgia. It was a 5-day war that sent a shockwave through the former Soviet sphere. The message was clear: Russia was willing to use its military to redraw borders and defend its interests. The West protested, but did little else. Emboldened, Putin made his boldest move yet in 2015. He intervened in the Syrian civil war. With a relatively small military force, he single-handedly propped up the regime of Bashar al-Assad, outmaneuvering the United States and re-establishing Russia as a decisive power broker in the Middle East. For the first time since the Cold War, Russia had a permanent military presence on the Mediterranean. The superpower dream was flickering back to life. The world was, once again, paying attention. But for Putin, all of this was a prelude to the main event: Ukraine. To him, a Ukraine that was independent, democratic, and drifting towards the European Union and NATO was an existential threat. It was the historical heart of ancient Rus, the cradle of Russian civilization. Losing Ukraine to the West was the ultimate symbol of the Soviet collapse, and he was determined to reverse it. In 2014, he annexed Crimea, a bold, lightning move that caught the world off guard. He then fomented a war in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine. For 8 years, this frozen conflict simmered, but it wasn't enough. In February 2022, Putin made the biggest gamble of his life. He launched a full-scale invasion, expecting to decapitate the Ukrainian government in days and absorb the nation back into Russia's orbit. He was not just invading a country, he was attempting to rewrite the post-Cold War settlement by force. He was trying to win, in one brutal stroke, the superpower status he felt Russia had been denied. The invasion of Ukraine did not go as planned. It didn't just stumble, it backfired catastrophically. Instead of a quick victory, Putin's army met ferocious, determined resistance from the Ukrainian people. Instead of dividing the West, he unified it like never before. NATO, which he sought to weaken, found a new sense of purpose, expanding to include Finland and Sweden. The Russian military, which had looked so modern and capable in Syria, was exposed as a corrupt, poorly led, and clumsy giant. But the most devastating consequence was the destruction of Putin's own narrative. He went to war to prove Russia was a great power. Instead, he revealed its profound weaknesses. His economy was slammed by unprecedented sanctions, cutting it off from Western technology and finance. His army was being bled dry by a much smaller nation. The war to restore the Soviet sphere of influence had instead turned Russia into a global pariah, a vassal state dependent on China. The superpower dream was not being resurrected on the battlefield. It was being buried there. So, where does this leave Russia? The dream of returning to its Cold War glory is now a fantasy. The war in Ukraine has irrevocably diminished Russia. Its military is weakened. Its economy is structurally crippled for a generation. its population is shrinking. Its best and brightest have fled the country. Geopolitically, it has never been more isolated. It has traded a diversified economy and global influence for a desperate, one-sided dependency on Beijing. Russia is now a junior partner to China, a raw materials supplier to a new superpower. This was the very opposite of Putin's revanchist goal. He wanted to escape the West's shadow, only to step into China. The invasion of Ukraine was meant to be the triumphant return of Russian power. Instead, it has become its epitaph. The rise and fall of Russia's superpower dream is a tragic story of a nation trapped by its own history. The Soviet Union collapsed because its rigid, ideological system could not adapt to the modern world. Vladimir Putin's Russia is collapsing for the same reason. It is trapped in a cycle of imperial nostalgia, trying to reclaim a past that is gone forever, using the very tools of brute force and aggression that failed it the first time. The Soviet Union was defeated not by American missiles, but by the superior economic and ideological power of the West. Putin's Russia is being defeated in the same way. By a coalition it underestimated, and an idea it could not crush. The idea of national sovereignty and the desire of people to choose their own future. The superpower dream is over. What remains is a diminished, paranoid, and dangerous state, sitting on a grave of its own, making a permanent monument to the folly of trying to conquer history.